Okay. So thank you everyone for joining. Yeah. So my idea is to have a discussion. So I'm going to present some of my research I've done since I left UF. So I was in Peru and Mexico, and I guess a little bit of my work when I was in the dissertation, and see that how it's formed my thinking a little bit about value change and the whole idea of inclusivity, and what's that mean for including groups that are resource poor, up through gender and ethnic groups and so on. And I'm trying to not create controversy, but have some questions, you know, to see what people think and where we're going, and some questions that arose in my mind that might go against what is the norm in the thinking a little bit, and where I think research should go. So, yes, like I said, my name's Trent Blare. I'm with UF, but I'm located way South Florida. I'm in Homestead, which is way south by the Keys. And my work here is basically also with smallholder producers, but in South Florida. So with that, I'm located Research and Extension Center. I just want to point out these research education centers, which I didn't know when I was a UF student, but there's 12 centers all over UF. And we're here actually can partner with you and do a lot of the same research that is done in the tropics. So for instance, here at my research center, there's research on mangoes and papaya and on passion fruit and on pitaya, dragon fruit. And there's all this natural resource work on climate change and habitat conservation. And so there's many opportunities to actually partner with researchers, because the reality is Florida is such a diverse state. Rather than just having like a couple crops, we have all these crops and tropical crops that are also relevant for much of the work that goes in Latin America, in the Caribbean, and Africa, and Asia, wherever your research may take you. So I just wanted to point that out and know that we're here to collaborate. And I mean, we have places to stay if you're ever coming down to Homestead and want to check out some work we're doing. We actually have student housing, a lot of the research centers do. So just to point out where some of these are, I don't know if you can see, I am the stat number 11, way south. But there's all these different research centers that you can look up. So what are some of the questions that I have now that I've been doing my value chain research? So when I left UF in food resource economics, I joined the World Agroforestry Center in Peru, and then worked for the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center in Mexico, and worked in value chains, which I didn't know much about at the time, and learned a lot about value chains and marketing, right? And so just, maybe I should have done this as a background, but the value chain is the whole process, no? From production all the way to consumption of different products. And there's a whole ideas about looking at the service provisions that go into it, you know, the commercial side, finances, input provision into a value chain, and a lot of the traditional value chain research was looking at how we can make this more efficient so that everyone in the chain can earn more, especially the smallholder, the farmer at the end. And how can they move up the chain and make greater value? And a lot of the work that I've done has been looking at specialty markets, right? For these niche markets for these products. But the question is, is the specialty market just that? Because they've seen a lot of growth and a lot of interest in the specialty market. Are they too small to really have an impact? Do local markets provide promise? So I think there has been this great push and this new interest in local markets, especially as we've grown in this COVID situation, right? Looking at interest in getting products locally and interest in our supply chains. How can we innovate on traditional farmers cooperatives? Are farmers cooperatives really working? And what are new strategies to get farmers into the value chain? And what are concepts of social inclusion, right? So this is all concepts of gender, getting women involved getting youth involved. Are these accurate? And how should we conceptualize these, and where do we need to question some of the research we're doing? Okay. So one of the first projects I did was on Camu Camu. So Camu Camu is this fruit you see here on the right. It's grown in the Amazon region. Probably a lot of you that are from Peru and probably from Brazil know Camu Camu, drink Camu Camu. And it has the highest amount of vitamin C of any fruit. grows naturally on riverbanks. It's grown in this flooded time. So when the flood, so if the rainy season comes and it floods, it has to have that time when actually you go out in the boats and harvest it. And at first was used for export markets. So Camu Camu became a boom in Peru at the time when Fujimori was president in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s. And he helped connect markets from Peru to Japan. And then also markets in the US grew for this because of this high vitamin C content, and it was all these juices and drinks and especially nutrition markets. But the market crashed in 2008. And this created huge problems because there's this big push to increase production among these farmers, and they become dependent on this crop. So they made great money that they could afford to improve their houses, send kids to school, improve food security, pay for medicine, and so on. But they had challenges in being dependent on crop. When it crashed, many of them lost their livelihoods, had loan guarantees on this, and many things. And some of the things that we saw when we studied this market was the difficulty in depending on export markets. So if you compare what happens at Camu Camu to acai, which was in Brazil, had a huge market where it was built up and then expanded and exported. So they had a regional market to depend on, not just on the export markets. And there was a big push increasing production without a look at opening markets and market development and product development and training farmers in business schools. And so a lesson learned in how we need to also have the business side combined with the production side if we want to look at these opportunities. But this is a lesson. This thing happens. So it's the same story over and over and over. So this is the market crash. You can see it. See how the market boomed in 2007, crashed, and came up a little bit when we was doing the research in 2014 and 15. And so this is a story. This happens, agriculture cycles all the time, right? The boom and bust. The question is how do we get around the boom and bust? Or maybe we accept there is a boom and bust, and what do we do about it? And do we become dependent on one crop? Then one idea that has been developed and pushed for a long time on the area of how do we get farmers these baseline prices and protect them from these problems of the markets is certification. So does certification live up to its promises, especially fair trade certification, right? So I think we all know about fair trade and the idea that farmers get paid a higher price for participating in these fair trade markets. They have a price floor. And what does that mean when they go to sell their products? And what does it bring benefits? There's been a lot of research showing that there's been benefits brought to smallholders who participate in fair trade, right? Like I was pointing out before, better livelihoods, they can invest in improved housing and education and so on, and better environmental outcomes, right? So if you see like Rainforest Alliance and others, you see the agroforestry system I have down the bottom, the planting of trees and so on in shade has led to great outcomes. But these markets have been shown to be unstable. And so what happens is you have this plethora, you have 10 like certification agencies, and you don't know what's the hot certification this year. And so this year it might be Rainforest, next year it might be the Starbucks, and the following year, you know, there could be bird friendly and the organic certification. So you have these diversified certification regimes that all these different that have slightly different requirements. You have to keep record keeping, and it comes this huge cost burden in these diversified standards that's inefficient. The question is, how can we normalize these markets? And at the same time, you had the same challenge we found before, is that people become dependent on one crop. They become dependent on coffee. And how can we push people to expand and use their diversified farming systems and open new markets? And there was something really interesting about fair trade. Many of the cooperatives stopped accepting members because the fair trade market had a glut. So there was just so much that was being bought at these prices, the fair trade prices, that was the market, and it stopped. And then anyone who wasn't in the cooperatives, sorry, but then all that could never participate in fair trade. They could participate in other certification schemes. So you led to this point of what is the market distortion, and how can we change the market so they pay a higher price? Or what's the future? And so it's really interesting to see, is certification really a future? How can we think about efficiencies in our markets? And there's this whole growth on micro, and I think there's an interesting thing for research, these micro lots. So you had coffee houses that would go straight to Central America and buy directly from a farmer. This research was in Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. So you go straight to a farmer and buy lots. Is that the future? Are these future of direct marketing and connections lead to more sustainable practice? That's something that hasn't been studied. And another area of research, right? So I was pointing out earlier, so you have the certification markets, these specialty markets, in an area within specialty markets is the local food markets, the local food system, and the promise of local foods for helping enhance livelihoods and well-being. And farmers, there's a dual benefit. And you hear this now in the COVID crisis. You see the long value chains and the shorter value chains that were connected, supply chains that were connected, are more resilient. And then the question is fresh food, your carbon footprint, of course, and conserving all these local varieties and traditional foods. So Cusco, Peru, was seen as an ideal area to invest in building these local food systems. And there was a whole lot of work from like the Clinton Foundation, from Swiss Contact, from hotels, restaurants, different private industries. That tied with the culinary boom in Peru. I think many people know about what's happened in Peru and the big restaurants and people going not just to go to Machu Picchu, but for gastronomic tourism and see all these opportunities. And there was growing interest even among local interest in buying more foods. And they seen this horrible logistics problem that happens in many countries, even in the United States, in the fact that a lot of the food that sourced Cusco came from Lima. So the food went from, it might have been harvested in Cusco, went to Lima and came back to Cusco processed, right? So you have these long supply chains that now have not been as resilient in Cusco. I was just talking to some colleagues in Cusco that there's several food products that they can't get because they have to depend on Lima. And then when people get sick, what does that mean? But the challenge of you had these great projects, right? So these restaurants was buying from this farmer, or McDonald's has set up, and seen in the bottom right hand is these greenhouses project. And so they could supply the high quality lettuce and so on that they needed, but they only needed so much lettuce, right? And so the question, so they work with 15 farmers, or in the biggest case was in native potatoes, worked with 30 households, and we have hundreds and hundreds of households. And so how do you bring these to scale when only you need so much, right? And how do you get it to a mass market and connecting with the consumers? That's the questions we're asking and looking at these local food systems. And the challenge is informality. So you have farmers that have their whole lives only sold in the market, have never had a receipt, never had a give tax statements. And then you have to wait, you bring your food to the restaurant and you have to wait 15 days, a month to get paid like the providers are service. So will this really work? And it was really interesting. I think you see in this in many agricultural products is not thinking about the diversity of the food system, right? So you see in the right-hand corner, they're growing strawberries. So there was like a couple, there was green leafy vegetables, there was flowers, there were strawberries that were a boom, and then everyone planted them, and then the market flooded. So the question is, how do we fill this diversified system and coordinate among different farmer groups and organizations to supply these systems, given the limited infrastructure and so on. What is the onda? With expanding local specialty markets, right? So we saw we have local foods and interest in local foods, and as you can see in Cusco, other research, I think these two tie into each other, is looking at expanding these markets for these different specialty products and opportunities. So one work was in Mexico, blue maize. So Mexico has all these varieties of landrace and native mazes. And looking at opportunities is the growing restaurant sector, especially, is making all these beautiful tortillas from maize. and before that work in Peru on native cacao. So a thing I want to point out that goes back to local markets and the research in Camu Camu is the interest in these growing regional and local markets. So especially in Latin America, we look at Latin America and they have these growing economies, right? These are all becoming middle income countries with a growing middle class. Of course, it's changed now. Will probably be drop the next couple of years with the recession and everything happening. But over the last few decades, you've seen this real income growth in Latin American countries. And so what does this mean about supplying your own? And what does it mean about consumers who have purchasing power that can provide these high quality products that when they're only looking for export markets before? It was really interesting, like looking in Peru at the cacao market. So if anyone has been, I've seen it in Ecuador too, and I've seen it happening in Mexico, starting to happen, is this growth in these local chocolate makers. Very high quality bean to bar chocolate. And a decade ago, there was just one major producer of chocolate in Peru. Now that you go to the fair for chocolate, there is at least 50 local producers among cooperatives, probably even around 100 cooperatives and these local bean to bar makers in Lima that are supplying. Now you find in Wong in the major grocery store, or in not even in specialty stores, getting out to mass consumer markets. So there's opportunities for these local markets, right? And buying lo nuestro, what is ours, right? And this pride and tradition, and same thing you've seen in tortillas, in maize in Mexico, that a few years ago was only this product that was seen and eaten by the lower classes mostly, or just on your farm. You had your milpa and you ate on your farm, but now it's going to the higher end restaurants and people are interested in it, and there's this growing demand. So is this an opportunity to conserve all these traditional varieties for agrodiversity? I mean, there's a big concern in conserving traditional varieties. One, to have all this genetic information if we need to produce other crops and so on. And biodiversity in itself, right? But the challenge is, as this growing new markets happen, the traditional market of going to your local market and selling your maize or your cacao to your trader has changed. And so what is the questions about the legal requirements? Formality, that's a big question I had earlier, right? And ramping, I meant to put ramping up production, right? Growing production, is hybrids a thing? That was a big thing we had in maize, to have these varieties, or should we need to conserve the traditional agrobiodiversity of these products? And then we have these opportunities, we have these markets, we have local markets, specialty markets, and so on. And the traditional way of looking at things are cooperatives. And are cooperatives really effective? Are farmer cooperatives effective, or how should we organize farmers to take advantage of the opportunities? So some research we did in Peru as well, in San Martin department, was looking at these emergent farmers cooperatives that were set up by the United Nations, USAID, GIZ, the Germans, as to support the projects to use cacao as an alternative to coca production at the end of the guerrilla wars in Peru. And the challenge that we saw is that many of these cooperatives were set up by these agencies as a ways to distribute the resources to the farmers and not by the farmers themselves. And so there wasn't this social cohesion and interest in maintaining the cooperative. And at the end, you had some cooperatives that grew and became large, but still were dependent on outside resources, and many small struggling cooperatives. So what do we see as success? How do we get these groups working? How do we get at the beginning of the value chain working together? And of course, access to financing is clear as in any business, but it was really much about business relationships, like being honest, having good communication, having a savvy manager who could connect and do business deals. And a lot of the cooperative directives, the farmers didn't have any business skills, right? And they were running them the ground by spending money they didn't have, and so on. but many of them were able to come back from them because they had good relationships with buyers who lent them money. So that was really interesting about how your trust and your communication is really key, but also social cohesion, right? So if there was a group that had worked together before in the community, especially ethnic groups that were the same groups, could work together better. But the question is that many of these are failed. I'll say the reality is you have like 30% of farmers that were in the cooperatives, 70% were out. And to get the high quality cacao you needed, you have to have like this post-harvest that Eduardo in the picture is doing, right? Where they work together and they can earn higher profits and so on, but people don't trust the cooperatives. They don't trust their neighbors. And how do we, what are the new ways for groups organized? It's always a cooperative. How can we reach all these dispersed farmers? One idea that was interesting from Exporter was that they just went out and they targeted a community leader. So they went to different communities, see who was a community leader, targeted him, and then built a group around that, these very informal groups to buy crops. But think of different, and they'll come to this at the end, of ideas of how to get the organize and have a social cohesion and cooperative action. So one idea also on this was some of, when you go into cooperatives and cutting out the middleman, was the work that I did in my dissertation. And we looked at the largest cacao exporter in Ecuador. And so what they had done is that they had set up their own groups, okay? So they set up their own groups, which lower transaction costs. So this was innovative at the time. Now it's happening a lot. So this is kind of the norm now. We're moving in establishing these markets. But they had set up their own groups, and that provides an opportunity to lower transaction costs in the sense that you don't have to pay the middleman to get the product, right? You can go directly to the farmer and establish a negotiated price without that extra burden. But to them was really important as well as to control post-harvest. So in these quality markets, they were able to set up their own drying and fermentation places to order control post-harvest. And what's really interesting, and I think this is a way, and I think something that's often overlooked, and we need to work more in value chains, what is the role of the consumers? So is it the consumers pulling change? How can consumers act to pull change? And one of the things was that they could sell the product as being this social product, right? Helping these farmers, they provide extension service, which they can control the quality of the product by doing that, but demonstrate their social responsibility by buying books in the school. They had the foundation that supported provision of quality water, clean water, and all these things to these communities. But what wasn't taken into consideration? Now, nothing wrong, this is the first step in how they do this, but the one big thing was were women included. In Ecuador, women have equal property rights, but it doesn't mean they have equal say over how the land's used, right? And so there was limited participation in training, leadership, especially marketing of the cacao. And they had a greater preferences for agroforestry systems, sustainable production systems. So that would be interesting if they're more included. And how about youth? Now we're looking at the intersectionality. How are we going to sustain these systems, right? So the big question in the last few years is how do we get youth involved as well? How do we sustain these systems, and where are the youth interested? Instead of migrating to cities where everyone thinks there's opportunities, how do we get it very interesting for youth? And something interesting, getting off here, but some interesting research we did in Peru right before I left. We also asked the families, how interested are you in having your son or daughter keep the farm, right? How interested, who would take over the farm? And a lot of them saw that farming wasn't as important as being a lawyer or a doctor or something else. But I think there's many different ways as we improve along the value chain. And I met this really fascinating woman, young lady in the Baraim in Peru, who actually started with her family and parents started their own chocolate company, right? And so how do we get this interest and maintaining these systems and advancing production? So this ties in, this is right now us discussing the girl in the Bahrain, was where we did this research specifically looking at gender roles and women's involvement. So this is a project led by Lutheran Road Relief and a cacao buyer. So this was really new. They were very successful, and so this was an area where farmers at the time, within the last 10 years, have returned after the Shining Path had been there and pushed a lot of many people out. Huge, still a lot of coca production and narco trafficking and so on. But a place that the government couldn't go, USAID couldn't go, but the Lutherans, they trusted them, could go, and business. And so we visited these farms, and they're very successful in increasing production. So they reactivated these cacao plantations that had been left out for 10 years. And this was like the heart of cacao growing region of Peru. It's in the Amazon region of Cusco, a lot of it. And, but we found, great, so you did all this, these people are getting better off, but a lot of the women said they were interested in working in the cacao fields, and they owned some of the cacao fields, but they were left out in marketing and extension services. So they did this interesting, very interesting project where they built, they actually made a cooperative that was all women. It was a women-led cooperative, right? And they now make chocolate and sell it. Another way is, how do you reach people? Much of the problem with women farmers is that they have a double burden, and they're taking care of the house, right? The children, and they can't leave to go to meetings. So they developed an app. And so this app, and they also send text messages. So the app is, you can get your technical questions or so on, and you can like video call in with an extensionist, or you'll get, if you don't have a smartphone, but surprisingly many people are still getting smartphones out in the Amazon even, you get text messages like reminding you this is the time to prune, this is the market prices for today, this is where you can sell, and providing great information. But the question still is, how do you move people up the value chain to get a higher price? So if they're looking at developing these chocolates, how do you get high quality in these very demanding markets? That's a change. And then what are the other economic activities? Maybe the economic activity or that women are interested in, or some, is not necessarily cacao production, right? And if you have a diversified livelihood system, you'll be more resistant to shocks. So a lot of the women had their small businesses and so on. And would it be interesting if there was a better way to support the development of small businesses and stores and schools and so on? But just this is just an example of the difference that we found between the genders. Like 82% of men knew who purchased their cacao, right? And only 55% of women. And 96% of men knew how much was sold, only 83% of women. What I think what's really interesting is in trainings, there's a great difference, right? 87% of men have participated in trainings, only 45% of women. 80% had the technician visit. The men participated, only 7% of women. And you can see, oops, here there's a large difference in the amount of times, the number of trainings that an average woman went to than an average man. So at the end, looking at then how can we become more inclusive, right? And there's been this big push since we did that research in 2017 about building inclusive value chains, something to also call inclusive business models that C4 really has been pushing. The idea that farmers are actually owners, shareholders in the business, right? So you have this business where they help make decisions, they sit on the board and so on. And collective action, right? Or solidary economy. That's a big discussion we have. How does the consumer as well become solidary with the producer? How do we reach these mechanisms? And I had working with a student from the University of Bern, and we examined the cacao value chain that usually just goes up to the market and export. So we looked at from Peru to Switzerland, right? And looking at the opportunities and even to Swiss consumers about cacao production. and looked at different cooperatives collectively owned. So there's a business called Choba Choba, which means working together, right? There's those of you like Quechua and Peru, where the farmers actually have ownership in the business, and being the barn businesses, both in Peru and in Europe. So the more inclusive ownership, where the smallholders have ownership in the business, we found that they earned higher income, had higher, could spend on, and we're spending them on assets, their children's education, home, and so on. But the problem is, are the profits in the long term, right? So can they compete? We don't know. These are very new. We don't know if we can compete with these big agribusinesses, right, where the margin is at the top. So that's a question for the future. Will consumers still buy them? And efforts to include the poor still overlook gender. So if you see this picture on the right, you see there is one strong woman in the middle of this cooperative meeting. Even though we're supposed to be inclusive in the ideas about gender, it's still a challenge. There was no difference in environmental outcomes between these solidarity, inclusive businesses versus farmers that just sold to the middlemen. And when does the customer get a say? That's the question. I think I pointed out. We're looking at the research. How do we involve customers back into having these solidarity economies and pushing for change? What can we as customers do? So what are some of the takeaways from this research that was, I think it's, try to not be so dispersed, but there's different ideas and looking at value chains. There's a boom and bust cycle for ag products. And I saw in cacao, I think it's going to happen in native maize. I think it'll happen in native cacao, all these different products. So when you're dependent on one crop, that becomes a problem, right? You might come in the right time for a boom, but it's going to bust sometime, right? So how do we have diversified systems? And what does this mean for like agroforestry systems and develop these sustainable environmental systems that are diverse, economically, financially more resilient, and also environmentally more resilient? And what does this mean? It's so much more complicated. Oh, we started doing some research in Brazil when I was leaving with Natura. I was trying to do agroforestry oil palm, right? So you had your supply chain for acai, you had for cacao, you had for oil palm, and many different fruits, copa azul, and they have their different infrastructure and storage issues and so on, right? So it's become this complex issue, and then about human capital, having the knowledge for these different systems, and then about household labor and how you divide it. So it's not like an easy solution, but I mean, the real solution is to understand how we can make these processes easier in developing these diversified systems that are more resilient to market shocks and more resilient environmentally, beneficially environmentally. Greater coordination among actors in the food system. Government, private sector, NGO, us as research institutions, universities, consumer groups, right? This is what we saw in Cusco, is that this divergence of actors that didn't talk to each other. I think seeing it in almost all the chains is something I can talk about, is how to develop ways to communicate among actors in the chain and those who provide services and so forth. There's technology. How do we use technology now? And this might be something beneficial of this COVID crisis, that we can all talk to each other by Zoom and WhatsApp, and we have these new ways of communicating. And who is the trusted broker, right? So we need someone that's been challenging. How do you build trust among these relationships to provide these products? So we pointed out in the cooperatives in Peru is that the most trusted relationships were able to expand and be resilient. In Cusco, one of the biggest complaints among restaurant owners is that to not look bad, the smallholders would tell them that they have the product when they don't, or they're going to deliver on time and then they don't, and then it all turns out bad, right? And so this building of trust and communication. And then the lack of business skills, right? But the question is this, that I've been raising the last years, because there's just been argument and big push to cut out the middleman. should we really cut out the middleman? Maybe he plays a role. Does the farmer want to be the middleman? I don't know. He might just like happy growing his product, and then he becomes the middleman. He gives up the time he could dedicate to his farm. Is there such a thing as an enlightened middleman that can be more socially conscious? Like maybe the farmer has ownership in the business, and so on. Lessons on social inclusion. So these are some questions I have that I might be a bit outside the box. So focusing on women may not lead to greater equality. What do I mean? There's been research, and this is the question, how do we get this, of milk production in Africa. This ECRAF had this great study and working with females controlled the milk industry. I think it was in Kenya. And so built up the milk industry, and they were earning more money, and the men saw that women were earning money from this, and they took it over, right? So how do we build this? And how do we build this discussion on gender relations, right? And who works in the household, right? And there was really interesting research when men found out how much that women do in the household. They began to do more because they realized the burden that a lot of women have. The question, who wants to participate? So we're saying, hey, we should get more women in the cacao value chain, but what if women don't want to be involved in the cacao chain? I know that's a bit controversial. Like, what are people's aspirations? I think one of the things a lot of research is going to ask, what do people really want to do? What's their aspirations, and how do we get them to go there than of what we think they should be doing, right? And reach it. And so that goes to a value judgment, right? And how do we do the value judgment about this resource poor? So the first thing that's been done in inclusive value chain is getting resource poor. Then looking at gender, how do we get women and men involved? And how we get youth involved, different ethnic groups, different types of headed households. So what do I mean there? I mean, what if it's a widow? I mean, so a lot of the researchers look at a male, female headed household, whether it's two brothers, different ways of looking at how we understand the different makeups of our households and opportunities. But is it just about providing equal opportunities? This goes aspirations. But the question then becomes, well, then maybe it's equal sharing of the benefits, right? And how can benefits be better shared around the households or decisions made on production practices, and what is fair in that? Those are challenges we face in values of research now. So how do we target our action research? So this is what I call, like here in UF and other places, is extension and research that come together, but it's there in many of development work as the practitioner and the researcher, right? So it's your research informing development and change. So I have a big question. It's like, I built this whole discussion and a lot of my research on markets, and there's been this underlying assumptions that markets are the best and people earn more money by participating in more markets. The question is, are markets the best option, right? If it leads to resource extraction, if a household meets their needs and satisfies what they have without being connected to a market, is that the best option? Should we be pushing markets so much? Should we be questioning the importance of markets? Role of technology, right? So there's this whole new things about having apps and sharing and leading, and now especially with the COVID crisis, how technology evolves in that. Study the effectiveness and impact of these innovative businesses I pointed out, like these new businesses where there's a shared ownership. It would be really interesting to see how benefits are shared. Are they effective? The long-term effects, and there's always unforeseen consequences. So at first we thought, great, getting farmers connected to smallholders, connected to markets will earn more income and they'll be better off, sure. But then we learned that many times women were left out, right? And then they might have been even worse off. So what are the consequences of some of these actions? I think where we really need to go is not just to see each value chain individually, each market individual, but look at the whole system. And how you do that, that's the question that people are tackling. Are there synergies between the different value chains, or are they competing with one another? Or interventions, the same, even on the same value chain, how do different interventions from different organizations affect it? Where's the lever of change, or should we be pulling different lever of changes? Is it the consumer? Is it the producer? Is it service providers? Is it the governance of the system? What does pulling one lever mean to something else? Landscapes. So what does an improved value chain and working with different value chains mean to the landscapes? What does it mean to deforestation, right? What does it mean to conservation of our resources and use of different resources? There's this really interesting work, I think, looking at how can we tie landscape research to value chain research? And what does multiple value chains mean to livelihoods? So one of the good examples I had when we were in Peru in the cooperatives is that one of the cooperatives wasn't very productive in cacao production. And the manager told us, well, it's because these are indigenous communities, and when it's harvest time, it's also the peak time for fishing, right? In a community called Chizuta. And so how do livelihoods fit with meet the markets? This is the most important thing to these communities, because the fishing was very, very important to their food security. And now what's the implications? I think there's a whole new world all over in COVID. I really think that we're going to go to shorter chains. We've seen that these long supply chains aren't so resilient. New ways of marketing that aren't face-to-face. You see the transmission of COVID in the markets in Latin America. It'll be really interesting to see how markets come back and what type of markets there are, right? And how transactions will be had. I think there will be a difference as people get used to technology. It'll be really interesting in areas for research to see how this whole pandemic will change the market structures and how we can take advantage of these opportunities and how we can make them more resilient. Even here in Florida, in South Florida, we're looking at all these farmers that were selling their products to the cruise lines and to restaurants. And when those closed in the pandemic, all of a sudden had opened to supermarkets and try to do direct sales with consumers. And I don't think all that's going away. And people will remember that. So the last thing I want to close, maybe this is a bit too busy, but this is a conceptualization that I really like. And it was done by one of my colleagues at Christoph Oberlach. He's a geographer at the University of Bern, and we have this paper coming out soon. And I think it's a good idea of how we want to look at the inclusivity of the systems approach. I like how this is getting me thinking about how we need to look at the systems approach and understanding the value chains in relation to everything else. And look at more of food systems, right? There's the three systems, you have your food chains, the service provisions, and the governance would be the political systems, and how those relate to each other and connecting these smallholders to the markets. And we were specifically looking in this paper about connecting landless or land poor households to markets. And how can they skip above and be involved and improve their livelihoods? And how can that be more inclusive and shared ownership and leadership and so on? So I just wanted to put this out there, not to explain this whole model, but to think about how the systems approach in the different the areas, and the natural resources where it's embedded, the food systems, and the information systems that's needed, and what is governments, and what does that lead each of these different areas into building these more sustainable, inclusive food systems. So thank you. I really appreciate everyone who participated and listened in, and I'm willing to have questions in the discussion.